Hey guys, welcome to the Conversation series. My name's Callum, this is Kieran, we're Tempest Calm, and we have the privilege of getting together and chatting, and what we're trying to do is document basically our album. We're releasing our album Shadowlands in track listing order, and this is video number 4. Our hope with this whole project is to be able to sort of share our Shadowlands experience with you and to remind you that you're not alone. I really believe that each of us as humans go through dark or hard times in our life, and one of the things that is a real challenge that we found when we walked through a particular one, which this whole album is about, is that it's really easy to feel alone and isolated in that place. And so we thought we'd have some conversations and film them in the hope that if you are experiencing either something similar or just in your own story you're going through a bit of a rough spot, that maybe this would encourage you. So yeah, thanks for being with us, and this is video number 4 about our song called Not There Yet. So this song, Not There Yet, is all about waiting in the tension of the in-between. Our last video was Dawn, which talked about anxiety and sort of finding perspective, and if you want to watch before that, just head back to the start. That'd probably make sense. But yeah, waiting in the in-between.
Yeah, so I think with Dawn, just to set some context, coming out of Dawn, with our last conversation vid, we kind of ended at that point where we were looking for the glimmer of hope. Like in your lyrics, you were talking about, having sleepless nights waiting for the hope of dawn to come. So for me, Not There Yet was the next step. So fast forward a little bit further, you've started to deal with the fact that there is hope on the horizon. Not There Yet was then about starting the journey of finding it and stepping into it. Yeah. But as you mentioned before, probably the main theme that came out of Not There Yet was the period of trying to wait. So knowing that what you wanted to look like in life was down there, but you still felt like you were here, and how to get there along that journey. Yeah. And probably worth talking about in this conversation vid about how we waited, and maybe some of the context behind exactly what was going on in our lives. Yeah. So, I mean, for me and for you and for our story, just to be clear, we're coming out of a transition of church hurt and brokenness, fallen humanity, things not going the way that we originally thought they would, and we find ourselves on a journey after going through the 3 conversation bids to where we are now, Not There Yet. Yeah. What was it like for you? Think about community. I mean, community for me was probably the biggest loss that I probably found. Absolutely.
I think community is really like, this song is a nod to community and really like the role that it played in our lives up to that point, and then suddenly losing that and realizing that you were trying to deal with all these really like difficult things without that community. It was really tough, and I think that's where this song was sort of birthed out of. But it's interesting with waiting. I was thinking about this on the way here. Is that waiting is something that we don't know how to do anymore. Like, you think everything that we do is at like at a grasp of our fingertips. Like socials, all information is online.
Fast-paced.
It's fast-paced. It just doesn't stop. Like, we don't know how to slow down. And so I think, especially back then when we went through this experience, I had no idea about how to slow down and sort of gather my thoughts and emotions and reflect. Everything was so instant. And so, this song was birthed out of actually a moment where I remember, like, it's the first line in the song, I pull the car in and sigh out loud. I never thought it'd come to this. It was this real moment of literally doing that, and then just sitting there waiting in the silence and just going like, oh man, like, how did I get here? Like, just actually realizing and stopping and going like, this is really difficult. You talk about community. Let's go down that line. I remember being in community where life was so like scheduled, and like the church culture that we were in was really fantastic in the sense that there was something to do so often. Like every second night of the week you had something on. But what it did was force this like community where like you were seeing people, you were experiencing life in a really deep way. Little things that come to memory is going to the cafe down the road after church. Every Sunday, and like coffee and like Caesar salads, and it was awesome, right? But that cafe would be like filled with laughter and filled with banter and all sorts, and then really serious chats. And if someone was going through a hard time, you'd sit there and you'd talk about that as a community. It was amazing. And then you think about other memories, like you flick back through, like my wife and I flick back through our wedding album, and
all the same
all
faces.
the same faces,
Yeah,
you know, like the concerts
people.
we went to, it's the same people.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting dynamic, experiencing life on such an intimate way to then suddenly no longer having those people, or most of those people, to sort of work through life with. And I think coming off the back of us leaving the church and that community essentially dissipating or splitting, I found it really, really tough to not have that community there to work that out with. Yeah.
Because I guess a lot of the waiting is asking the question of why, right? Why did this happen? Why me? You go quite insular, don't you? You turn in on yourself.
That's the natural response, right?
And without realising, you probably isolate yourself from your friends, from your family, as you try to articulate the why behind the reason things happen and the way they turn out that certain way.
Yeah.
I would say. For me, waiting was incredibly difficult as well, because I also was scared of entering back in, if that makes sense. So you just talked about a moment where you have your friends that you do life with for so long, all your best memories growing up as a teenager in your early 20s, and then you go through something like this, which is quite horrific or traumatic. I was scared in the waiting period because I was also scared to step back into church, church culture on a broader scale, community, because you've gone through the most amazing community of your life. And this would be the same for people and their families, you know, with hurt and trauma and all that kind of stuff. Like, you experience what a blessing looks like, but then when it's removed from you, there's a tendency to go inwards to protect yourself, because you don't want to really actually step out into it in case it happens again.
Yeah, and I think coming from like our story mentioned, it can happen in any community where there's people. It can happen, right? But ours was the context was church, and so like the fear of stepping back into that as well was so scary, because you'd go, number one, like, here were all these systems in place that, like, I'm looking at that and going, oh, well, that failed me as a system, in the way that it all fell apart. But then you also know that, like, you're coming off your experience of like 20 something years where it's so deep, and those relationships are formed over that amount of time, and then to step back into a system with a different set of people, it just doesn't feel the same. Like, it just doesn't work. You feel like you're rubbing up the wrong way. A square peg trying to fit into a round hole, you know? So there was that real challenge of that. I mean, we're talking about like some difficult things. So how did you find that, like, with, let's just talk about the humanness of it. So outside
how
of other
we
people.
deal with the waiting? That's probably an honest question. Like, how did you deal with the waiting? How did I deal with the waiting? Like, I didn't deal with the waiting very well, if I'm honest. I probably find hindsight's a blessing, right? Because you can look back at where that 5-year period went. And I probably found that I was very defensive, and I went very quickly to, I will do this myself, and I will get through this myself. To the point where I look back now, even when we started re-entering with church, it's fascinating to think that you and I started going to different churches.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what it was about, something about the fact that I thought, I'm going to do this myself. Because, and there was nothing against you or against my family, it's just, that's how I want to deal with it. I thought, I'm just going to do this myself because it didn't work last time.
Yeah.
But I would have to say, like, from an honest point of view, like, it had an impact on my marriage. So I look 2 years down the track, you're becoming best mates rather than spouses. And I think it's because I started to exercise this feeling of protecting myself from hurt. And probably my tendency then was to protect myself from anyone. And my wife is amazing, you know, and I find myself protecting myself from what could happen in our marriage. And I look back 2-3 years later and you go, wow, we could have really grown apart, but the grace of God that restores us, you know. So, I mean, I wanted to call that out because it happens, you know, and we live these lives where we carry on thinking we've got it all sorted out and we're all good and we excel at what we do, and don't worry about us, we've got it under control, because that's the exterior you put out. But inside you're like devastated.
Yeah, you're breaking.
You've gone through trauma, you're trying to work out what's going on, you're losing your identity. So I didn't wait well. Coming out of that, which is what this song's about, going through that process, I look back and go, thank you for the Lord. Thank you for his grace, and that I can look back and see that he's carried me and my family and all of us through it.
Yeah.
But that were my struggles. What about your struggles with waiting?
Yeah. I think what you said about marriage is so true. There's that tension there where you go like, I've been hurt before. I remember Carrie saying to us, like, one day we'll look back and we'll celebrate this, you know, which we do now. But at the time, man, I didn't have that perspective at all. Things for me, I definitely found in myself that there was a lack of trust in other people. That was probably the biggest thing for me. Like I talked about the system before and like questioning the system, you know, I definitely went through a stage where I was like, I don't want to be in church and I don't want to be a part of the system. But I think more than that, I just didn't want to allow myself to get hurt again by people who I loved and trusted so much. That was the thing that really, it was like a barb in my heart, you know, it got me really good. So yeah, and when you stop and you slow down, you start considering these things, you realize I can either be refined by this, and it can change me, or I can be crippled by this and it'll break me. And I think that's where this song reflects that, you know. And not to go back to it, but we talked about Dawn, track 3, being a moment where perspective was shifted. And so track 4, this is with a better perspective, realizing that one of the lines is, in some way we are meant to view the whole thing with grace, irrespective of the circumstance. And I wanted to view this with grace, but like I couldn't quite get there. This whole journey, or this point in the journey, and what this song reflects is waiting in that moment, in that tension where you're caught in between those things.
I think it's important to normalise as well, irrespective of the circumstance, takes time.
Yeah.
You know, like, and you said before about church, I was the same. Re-entering church, I sat at the back, very bitter for quite a while, as I had to process some deep things going into my own spirit. But I think that's okay to normalise that conversation, that it takes time, because the old me would have said the band-aid fix is get back to church, and you know, like, but we have to give it the time it needs to process the pain that you've gone through.
I think like let's just like go straight for it here, because I want to say like church was not the fix. You know, like what was the fix in this whole thing, and we'll touch on this more as we get towards the end of the record. But like for me, I realised that I needed to know who God was outside of the system. I needed to find that, and we talked about that in Shadowlands. Like he found me in the shadows, he found me in the dark, and I needed to realise that you know, my faith had to become real to me outside of the constructs of religion. And so much of this song, although it doesn't overtly say that, is the wrestling and trying to find that. It's trying to discover that perspective. Yeah,
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's good.
So on that point then, when you start talking about like structure of the song, or the way the song was written, how did you, even crafting the lyrics or crafting the song, how did you craft in a way to represent what we've just been talking about? How did you capture the waiting period? That's a hard thing to do. Capture the waiting period sonically.
Well, I think I talk about the story. So like verse 1, I'm setting the scene lyrically. Verse 2, like, because when you write a song, you never, like, I've written hundreds of songs, but like a handful of them I share with people. So I think for me, I go in with the point of like it's not necessarily on my mind that, oh, people are going to hear this. This is just me working out what's going on here and in my head and trying to make sense of it all. So verse 2 turned out to be this reflection. I guess I'm struggling to let you go, because honestly this tore me apart. There's a part of me that wishes I could go back again, and in the end it's better left behind. I wrestle with injustice and I hate this plight, and I recognise that fate will play its hand, and in some way we're meant to view the whole thing with grace, irrespective of the circumstance, but I'm not there yet.
I'm not there yet.
So yeah, it was just this storytelling, really quite unintentional, if I'm honest. It was just me like blabbering on a page and like standing there with my phone, you know, like singing into it and trying to work it out. What about you though, like tonally? Because I obviously bring you.
Yeah, it was a different song, wasn't it? Because we wrote. I think you probably had some of the chord structure down, and you would have had the catchy chorus. But this is one of the ones that we wrote, mostly produced in the home studio, right? So it formed from the point of Sonic. Interesting for me is when I go back and I wrote this song and produced this track, I'm probably looking at it more from I'm getting closer. So I'm not there yet, but I'm getting closer, because where I was in my life at that stage, and we'd started processing some of these thoughts. So for me, it's how do I go back and start to capture I'm getting closer. So sonically, and again, like you just said with lyrics, you don't necessarily have all this in your mind, at the forefront of your mind. A lot of this is subconscious, as you're right. But I started the track straight away with like a percussive rhythm and simple patterns and loops that built on throughout the whole track. But for me, that was a way of saying it was a journey. Like, of all the songs on the record, this is the one I put on in the car, and I can kind of spot my head along to as I'm driving, because it's got that motion. The track has motion in it from the very start, and I purposely started that way to set on the journey that I'm not there yet, but I'm getting closer, because the whole thing is supposed to be a journey. And structurally as well, it was an interesting track, because we tend to build our songs on quite a linear, so it finishes quite strong in the bridge. We'll often do that, and we did that for this track. And then as a band, we decided that we couldn't crash heavy with the bridge. It had to actually stay at a pretty similar. Yeah, we were just sort of like chugging along. Yeah, and that's what the song was. It represents the getting closer, more so than I'm there. That's what the song is to me on a journey. Yeah. From a tonality point of view as well, I probably found that if you talk about like a note being a true value, so like C is a true value of C, I found with a track like this, using really simple melodies but chucking on your distortions, your pitch bends, your modulation, you were finding the true value of the note, but you're just shifting it ever so slightly, even with your simple melodies. So
just to like create that,
I'd just be stirring up in myself how I felt that again I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there yet. So yeah, it could sound silly to some people, but from a simple melody line, you're like, this is what the melody is, but it's not quite there. It's just off, whether that's distortion, whether that's whatever. And I found that I would use a lot of ambient sounds that were yearning, and I love that anyway, your whale noises or whatever you've got. But this was a track that, for the first one out of the record, I could really soak in that, because everything about this track was, I'm yearning to be somewhere.
Yes.
But it's also recognising that we're now well on our way. We've taken the steps forward. We've admitted we're bitter. We've admitted we're not always in the right spot. We've admitted we don't want to be these people in 10 years' time. So not there yet, but I'm getting closer. For me was really sonically, how do I portray I'm getting closer? And that's what sonically was.
I remember hearing it and it just being like, I mean, I think like you've mentioned this before, but there was lots of versions, and then hearing that version when we rolled into your studio and just listened to it, I was like, man, like, I know the song's about not getting there, but with this song I felt like, oh, we're here. Like
we had direction for that.
It got there. I think like going back to community, and just the importance of that, there was a real turning point for me, where I hadn't had that community, and we talked about the tension of not wanting to, like the fear of going back to it. I had a real moment where I went out with my wife and some friends who are like now really dear friends of ours, just to Northbridge, and we were sitting there having beers and food and just talking about God and culture and life. And for the first time, I reckon in probably at least a year and a half, I walked away from that night feeling so edified. So like I felt like I'd been to church, that whole like iron sharpens iron thing. And I walked out of the bar and I said to Carrie, like, man, like it feels like we're back at church. Like I've missed that community. I've missed that, like that depth of relationship. And I say that just because I think it's important to note that, like, again, like the structure of church, like church is a great thing, but the structure of that isn't the answer either. It's the depth of relationship that you have with people where you can be honest and real and vulnerable and say like, man, I'm breaking here. Or I want to celebrate the wins with you as much as I want to, like grieve the losses with you. And I think that's something really important for people to be able to cling to and aim for. Just to get back to the very beginning of this video where we said, this is for other people. This is hopefully to encourage people not to be alone. Like I'd really encourage people just to like find someone who you can trust and to not try to go through the experiences of dark times alone. Because we've talked about it. There's a danger in isolating. There's a danger in trying to work it out yourself. So just to encourage you as we leave, and if you can, try and find people to experience your highs and your lows with, to celebrate your wins with, and to grieve your losses with. I think back to something as well, like we're talking about slowing down and resting, and this just pops into my mind now, but part of slowing down is finding rest. And we've talked about our journey so far and finding God and finding Jesus separate to religion. And he calls us to find rest in him. Come to me, you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Yeah. He is the only place I can say now where I can look back and go, like, I found rest in him. I found rest in his presence outside of the noise and the chaos and the tension that was going on.
Yeah, it's good.
Awesome, man. That's it. Look, guys, thank you so much for joining us again. Like we hope that this you find it helpful, and you find hope in your own story, in your own circumstance. If you're doing it rough, you can always reach out to us online. You can hit tempestcalm.com, and our email's there. Check out the other stuff, and we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your stories, and thanks for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.